Welcome to Thrive Deeper, the show based on the Thrive Bible reading guides. This is an ongoing conversation about God's Word with Thrive author, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Well, Matt, here we are, Daniel chapter 7, as we continue Thrive Deeper and our walk through the book of Daniel, and man, there is a lot of ground to cover.
If all of my notes on, chapters 7 to 12 were represented by post-it notes, Stu, this whole room would be covered in post-it notes. There's so much.
Mate, I've got 22 A4 pages of notes that I scribbled down as we read through this. So
we're going to be very disciplined today, folks, and we're going to try to move through this in a way that focuses on the meaning, but there are some really interesting details here.
Yeah, absolutely.
As well.
So just a reminder for listeners, the book of Daniel consists of both history and prophecy. So in one sense, you could say history past and history future. Chapters 1 to 6, which we've already covered, were largely historical and chronological in nature. Chapters to 7 to 12 are prophetic. And so these chapters consist really of 4 primary prophetic dreams and visions that were given to Daniel. And these dreams and visions were given during the same period of the first 6 chapters, in a sense. So we're now putting in what was happening in terms of these dreams and visions and prophecies for Daniel that took place in the same time period as chapters 1 through to 6. Now, chapter 7 is pretty important because it provides a bit of a foundation for the basis of understanding the subsequent revelations that come through the rest of the book. Important to understand that context. And of course, some of these visions, as we said, are past history, but of course, to Daniel at the time, they were not. So it's great that we can look at this and go, that's that, and that was this. But of course, we've got to remember in Daniel's time, these things just seemed completely, he wouldn't have had a clue what really was going on. And hence, there was a number of opportunities where Gabriel came to actually explain these visions to Daniel. So let's jump into chapter 7.
Jump in, probably just a big framework thing to keep in mind as we look through this. One of the themes that I talked about a bit when we looked at the first part of the book, Stu, was that big theme of God's sovereignty over all the nations. Here is Judah in exile in a foreign land. What about the promises? Big promises for the whole of the earth.
Yep.
What's happened with those?
Yes.
Well, God is saying here, I am sovereign. I'm not just the God of Judah. I am the God of the whole earth, and I'm working all things for the good of those who love me. And so we see that continued. These visions are going to really underscore that theme of God's sovereignty as we see various nations coming and going. And it's interesting as we launch into chapter 7, Stu, it begins with, in verse 2, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the 4 winds of heaven churning up the great sea. And that's a significant comment because, of course, it takes us back to Genesis chapter 1, that primeval chaos, the watery chaos, that symbol of chaos and death. And this is the realm out of which these 4 beasts come. And this is important because the churning sea stands for this worldly chaos. The world has been cast back into chaos.
Yes.
And what we see here actually is the winds of heaven stirring up the chaos. As God stirs up the chaos, the realm of chaos, 4 beasts emerge. So in a sense, what this is saying is that God is stirring this up. And in a sense, God is sovereignly calling forth these 4 beasts.
Yes.
The fact that they're beasts indicates, and they're composite creatures. This is we of course remember Nebuchadnezzar became like a beast.
Yes.
We've got to keep that in mind as well. Out of his rebellion and his pride, he became like a beast. And so this is a degraded humanity, and it's indicated partly in the way that the beast that we're going to see, so the first, he says, was like a lion and it had the wings of an eagle.
So that speaks to the Babylonian Empire.
That's right. And then another one, there's the bear, that's pretty straightforward, but there's the leopard that has 4 wings like that of a bird. These aren't so much virtues of signs of rebellion, of things being outside of the way that God created them to be. Because remember, in Genesis 1, we read 10 times it says corresponding with 10 divine commands in Genesis chapter 1, that God created everything according to its kind. And what you get is in these composite creatures, they're breaking out of the kinds, in a sense.
Yeah.
So these are nations symbolized by, and you know, the sort of attributes that they have. They do symbolize things, but the fact that they are composite creatures does indicate that they are outside of creation, the way that God created it to be.
Yeah.
And God is calling these rebellious nations out. So God's doing the summoning here.
Yeah, right.
And God is going to raise them up and bring them down.
Yeah.
God is sovereign.
Yeah.
That's an important theme.
So let's look at the beasts. And again, I think it's important to perhaps recognise that this is somewhat a bit of a parallel to the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had in chapter 2, but he saw this as a statue in a sense. So the lion with the eagle's wings represented the Babylonian Empire. We've spoken to that. The bear raised up on one side is the Medes and the Persian Empire, and some would suggest that it's up on one side because the Persians were more powerful than the Medes. It had 3 ribs in its mouth, which speak of the great conquests of the empire, which defeated Babylon, Lydia, and Egypt. Then we move on to the leopard with the 4 wings and the 4 heads. This was likely the Greek Empire. This vision emphasizes the swiftness of its exploits. By the age of 28, Alexander the Great had conquered the civilized world. Commentators have pointed out that there's nothing in the history of the world that was equal to the swiftness of his conquests. Yeah. But of course, we also know that the beast had 4 heads. And as we know, when Alexander died, the kingdom wasn't passed on to any successor. It was passed on to 4 different generals or whatever who took over as succeeding from Alexander. And then the last beast, the powerful beast with iron teeth, represents the Roman Empire. And it's pictured as a powerful beast with iron teeth. Roman Empire was known for their use of iron, and iron represented their immense strength. And there are different stages of the Roman Empire, obviously, and of course we remember in the statue that there was iron feet but with clay toes, and we're going to come back to the 10 toes, I'm sure, a little later as we talk. So those are the beasts that come up. And obviously Daniel pays a lot of attention in particular to the 4th beast because he said it was terrifying and very powerful and different to the other beasts. Yeah.
And this is important, Stu, because Judah, the Jewish people, are going to be subject to all of those nations at some point. And so they need to know beforehand, and it's the beforehand that's important because there's a sense of sovereignty. God is saying, none of this is happening outside of my sovereignty. Yeah. I am raising up these nations and bringing them down. And so they know that as these things happen, it's not outside God's control. In fact, it confirms to them that their God is in control.
In a sense, he's saying, be prepared for this. It's coming, and and I'm allowing this to happen in this way, totally. Now, the other thing that's important probably around this is that we kind of see, we've got 2 glimpses into 2 different areas. We can see what's happening on earth at the time, with the conquests and these things happening to the nation of Judah. But we also see different scene emerging at the same time in heaven, so it's sort of running parallel. So while all this is happening on the earthly side of things, there's also this other dimension happening in heaven, which we also see in the second part of that with the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man.
Yeah, that's right.
Part of the vision.
The 10 horns, we have these 10 horns. Now we seem to be projecting forwards still into the future. And this is a very common thing. Often when immediate, and of course this is more than immediate, this is predicting hundreds of years, but the way that prophets often saw the future was they often foreshortened it, and so future events were often told in the same breath as more localized immediate events. And that's important too for chapter 12. When we get to chapter 12, it's going to be important because it describes in a lot of detail immediate events, and then suddenly you're at the end.
Yes.
Often the relationship between the kinds of events is that you get this, with these empires, you get this sort of rhythm, right? This is the way it is. Empire rises, falls, rises, falls, rises, falls. And then it jumps to the end. You get the sense that it's like et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is the way that world history is. Kingdoms are going to rise and fall pretty much right up to the end. And then the final, and that sort of kind of fast forwards to the final kingdom. And of course that will fall too. And that's when you get the introduction of the Messiah, this Messiah figure, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Yeah. So the projecting forward here has to do both with the 10 horns, and whatever that means. And
we see that in Revelation as well, in chapter 17, I think it is, of Revelation. We see that it talks about the 10 horns representing 10 kings.
Yeah, that's right. And then there's the little horn, and a lot of scholars identify that with the Antichrist and so forth. So at this point, Stu, I just sound a note of caution. I think with some of these things, it's important to put limits around our speculation.
Totally.
We don't do ourselves any favour by just assuming that such and such, or this confederation, or something that happens. This is what it.
This is
it
what
says
the 10
in Daniel.
horns
That's
are.
right. I mean, exactly. I think
totally.
The problem with that is that we can just get waylaid, and often if it's not that, I don't know. It's just not always fruitful. I think we should always be aware. I think we should recognize, of course, that God is sovereign, and that these are things that are going to come about. But there are lots of versions of this as we move through history.
Yeah.
And as over even just the last 2,000 years since the time of the Roman Empire, there have been many antichrists. In that sense, and people have speculated all along the way. This is the anti. This in a way they're right. This is really what this is saying. Nations rise and fall. Even Jesus, predicted the coming of many sort of antichrists in a sense. So, but there will be one final one. So just during the Second World War, of course, you can imagine people are thinking Hitler is the Antichrist, and in a sense, he is a type of that Antichrist. I mean, when the Romans defeated, Jerusalem and trampled the holy place of the temple, it was thought that's the fulfillment. Well, it was a fulfillment. There would be many moving forwards.
And we'll be speaking to one of those a little later, obviously, in Antiochus Epiphanes, who I think was considered one of them as well, with the Maccabean revolt that comes later. So I think that's a really good point, Matt. I mean, there's lots of people who point to the fact that there are, the world's divided up currently into 10 regional areas and all those sorts of things. And it could be the case. I think it's important not to pay attention, because I think part of the purpose of prophecy is so that God's people can pay attention.
That's right.
But as you say, don't get into the position where we're just consumed by trying to join dots without actually asking ourselves the question, what does it mean for me tomorrow? And how I live my life reflecting Christ.
Yeah. I mean, I think it takes the surprise, perhaps the shock factor, even though things that will happen in our world that are shocking in another respect, but not that surprise shock, because we're led to understand that things like this will happen right up to the end. This sets up a kind of pattern, and we can expect these things to be repeated right up until the end. And so I think it is right to read human history in the light of prophecy, as long as we're not trying to lock it down too much and come up with theories. And then, I always think, the Jewish people had very fixed ideas of what the coming of the Messiah would look like.
Yes.
And they all got it wrong, pretty much. And it was different to what anyone expected.
Yeah.
So I think that may well be the case with the second coming of Christ, that it'll be different to what any of us expect. But, I think it's still okay to speculate somewhat.
And to be aware of what's happening.
Now, whenever we get to these points where you get this kind of final climactic rebellion, you get this introduction of this heavenly perspective, and here is, where it jumps into the heavenly places, and thrones were set in place. The Ancient of Days took his seat and his clothes.
Chapter 7, verse 9.
So you shoot to this kind of heavenly courtroom
setting,
perspective. And in the light of this beast, this final beast is slain. And then it says, famously in verse 13, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man. Coming with the clouds of heaven, he approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed."
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing about this Son of Man figure, there's pretty much universal consensus that one like a son of man, that means simply one like a human being. And generally figures in human likeness in the context of late prophetic and early apocalyptic visions are generally found to represent angels.
Yeah.
But there's something unique about this, and generally scholars agree that this one, like a son of man, is attributed with divine
authority.
Divine. Well, not only just divine authority, but is in himself divine in some significant sense. And also, there was a important, traditional piece of Jewish writing around the Book of Enoch at the time, and it's not included in the inspired scriptures, but it's an important comparative document. And here in the similitudes of Enoch, first Enoch, we have this white-headed head of days, as he's called, and he's accompanied by one whose face had the appearance of man, and he's there explicitly called Messiah, or the Anointed One. And also, he is, in some sense, a pre-existent supernatural figure. It says there that this is he whom the Most High has been keeping for many ages. So this is very messianic here in its context, very, very messianic.
And let's remember that Jesus used the term the Son of Man more than any other, really, in terms of describing himself.
That's right.
So in some ways that kind of does reinforce that, although probably later on in the chapter there are some bits that might bring into question around that, whether it was an angel or whether it was Jesus at this point in time. But again, these are the things we can get hung up on and probably aren't.
Although the coming with the clouds of heaven, this entourage of clouds normally denotes divine status in Israel. That's a way of signifying divine status.
Right.
This is God coming. So, when Jesus talks about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, he is... he's using divine descriptions of himself there. This is actually a clearer indication of the divinity of the coming Messiah as anything that you've got, really, in the Old Testament, including, Isaiah 9, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father. You need to put those things together with this to get a clear picture of the status of the coming Messiah. And there's every indication, as inscrutable as the idea is, that nevertheless the Messiah was always understood in the context of Scripture to be a divine Messiah. Yeah. So this is, wow, this is really significant stuff, and this is predicting the everlasting kingdom of God, ultimately. So,
and of course, let's remember for Daniel, this is all pretty out there, really. I mean, he as he says himself, says, for me, my spirit was deeply distressed within me, and the visions in my mind terrified me. So, we read these things kind of now, and we think of them in a certain way, but you've got to understand, for Daniel, this was like, what am I meant to do with this? And they did disturb him. And
that's right.
So he asks really for the true meaning.
Yeah. That's right. And so the rest of the chapter gives that interpretation. So in summary, we've got a sweep of history here, immediate kingdom that connects to the end. It's sort of in the foreshortened. It's like this kingdom, next kingdom, next kingdom, next kingdom, sort of etc.
Yes,
okay, that's world history, know, and then it sort of foreshortens to the final kingdom, and then the final destruction of the sort of consummate kingdom of the world.
Yes,
and then the return of the Messiah and the establishment of the everlasting kingdom of God. That's all. I mean, man, that is massive.
There's plenty there.
Yeah,
for sure.
So, chapter 8, Stu.
The vision of the ram and the goat.
Yeah. So, give us the summary here.
Yeah. Let me just find that in my page, 732. So Daniel, probably, just for context as well, probably is in his 80s at this point in time, mid 80s probably. So he's getting on. It's the third year of King Belshazzar's reign. Babylon is still the ruling world power. And again, of course, God gives him this vision. Daniel sees himself in a particular place, in a place called Susa, and a very strange kind of battle that takes place. He sees two horned rams that no animal could stand against. Sorry, he sees a two-horned ram that no animal could stand against. It went north, it went west, and it went south. It just about basically went wherever it pleased in reality. It was totally powerful and dominant. But then it comes across the shaggy goat with the prominent horn, and to cut a long story short, the goat smashes the ram and tramples it all over it, and then the goat becomes the main player, the numero uno, but at the height of its power, its prominent horn was broken off and four lesser horns grew up, which of course sounds very similar to
what we've already seen.
Talked about with Alexander.
So in a way, this is focusing in on something that we've seen. So this is you get very broad terms in chapter 7. Now this is focusing on a period actually that was to be very significant for the Jewish people.
Well, this is the capture of Babylon, essentially.
Yeah. So you've got the ram with the 2 horns, which is the Medo-Persian Empire. Yeah. The goat, of course, is Alexander the Greek Empire with the prominent horn. This actually jumps forward to, because the significant moment I'm talking about actually is the time after Alexander the Great.
That's right.
When the Greek emperor Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV Epiphanes to be specific, outlawed Judaism actually, and he desecrated the temple, offered pig sacrifices in the temple, killed the high priest. This was a very, very serious and significant time, and it led to the famous Maccabean revolt and to the establishment of a 100-year independent Jewish kingdom until the Romans came, of course. So that was that's a very significant period. So this is kind of preparing them for that, and because there's going to be a lot required of the Jewish people during this time. A lot of people are going to abandon their faith and essentially Hellenize is the word when you sort of follow the Greek ways.
Yep.
But these events that begin around sort of 169 BC, this is going to be the making of the Judaism that Jesus is going to encounter in the first century, that kind of Pharisaic, not in its negative sense, I may say, but in that level of devotion to the Jewish faith, with an emphasis on keeping the Sabbath because during the Maccabean revolt, they're going to die for this.
Yes.
And so these become the markers of true Judaism. So they're getting a forewarning about this.
And really interesting to note too, the temple, it prophesies here that it'll be for 2,300 evenings and mornings. And in fact, from historical records, it was basically from September the 6th, 171 BC to December the 25th, 165 BC, which is 2,300 days. So amazing here. And obviously, some people would suggest that passage or that vision is now fully fulfilled. Others would suggest that perhaps it's also pointing to the next, as you said before, the next Antichrist in a sense, which could be Hitler, but also to the future end times Antichrist as well.
Yeah, well, Antiochus IV Epiphanes does become a type of the Antichrist, and so there's this double reference here.
Yeah,
becomes a sort of prefiguration of something that was actually going to happen. It happened again in 70 AD. There was a desecration and abomination that causes desolation. Jesus makes reference to that in Matthew chapter 24, predicting that the temple's going to be desecrated again. But even that, potentially refers beyond that. Pompey, the general Pompey, in when the Romans in around 63 BC, when the Romans took over the region of Judea, General Pompey marched into the Holy of Holies in the temple, and that itself was an act of desecration. So there's this sort of repeated, this tends to happen again and again. But the point is that particularly Antiochus Epiphanes becomes becomes a sort of prefiguration of the kind of final, this kind of final Antichrist figure.
Into chapter 9 and Daniel's prayer.
Prompted by his reading of the scriptures and the promise to Jeremiah that this exile was going to last this 70-year period. It doesn't matter about the exactness. And I think this is worth saying at the beginning of chapter 9, 70 in Hebrew literature, but also actually in some other ancient Near Eastern literature, is this kind of round figure to describe a kind of a lifetime in a way. Right. And so... it doesn't have to be an exact figure necessarily. And even when we get to the second half of chapter 7, it talks about groups of sevens.
Well, you even see, if you do a search through your Bible for where the word 7 comes up, or even 70 times 7 or 7 times 7, it's not usually attached to something like a time frame that we would know necessarily. So it'll just say 70 times 7 or 7 sevens, or not necessarily weeks or months or years or anything. It's just, as you say, a period of time that's considered to be a lifetime or a portion of a lifetime.
Yeah. The prayer of Daniel has always been, Stu, one of my favourite parts of Scripture. It's just profound, particularly in the way that he collectivizes this prayer. It's we have sinned. This is Daniel praying this. I mean, Daniel is a very godly man. I mean, even the angels say about Daniel, "You are highly regarded, highly esteemed."
Yeah.
Right, and yet this man who was highly esteemed in the view of heaven,
we are covered with shame.
Puts on sackcloth these signs of repentance and penitence, and he includes himself with his people. He says, "We have sinned, we are covered with shame."
The collective responsibility.
That's the correct collective responsibility. And so you get this prayer. And in answer to this prayer, basically in broad terms, this is where it gets this is where it gets complicated. But the answer is to the effect that, yes, in one sense, the historical exile in Babylon is over, but the dealing with the sin of the people, and exile perhaps in a bigger sense, captivity in a bigger sense, is not going to be solved for another long period, and it ends up being sort of 490 years. You put again, we're working with the sevens here, as it says, but he says 77s are decreed. This is in verse 24. 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression. Now, of course, the year of Jubilee, there's reference here to the year of Jubilee, and the 49th year, 7 times 7 years. There was to be a proclamation of Jubilee, releasing the slaves from prison. So there's going to be a kind of Jubilee of years. Yeah. And, not 49 years, but, 490 years. Yeah. And during that period, that's the period assigned to the people for pretty much dealing with their sin, finally.
So that restoration
can come. So that restoration can come. He goes on to say in verse 25, "No one understand this. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Anointed One, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens." It's interesting that he divides these up. So and here we don't even have the final 7. So there's actually 3 divisions.
That's right.
There's that first period, the 7 sevens. So something significant is going to happen after the 7 sevens. Then there's going to be 62 sevens, after which something significant is going to happen. Yeah. And then you're going to get the final 7. What did you make of it, Stu?
Yeah, I didn't. I did all the math, but it was interesting because, some of the dates quoted and when some of these things happened all aligned with a particular date, and it's interesting what's known from the old world biblical calendar as Nisan 10, which is the first calendar month of the calendar year, and the prophetic. If you apply that mathematics up to the last 7, obviously you end up landing on what's known as Nisan 10, which 33 AD, which was obviously, as we know, the day of Christ's crucifixion. But also on the same day, as we look back through Scripture, it was on the same day or month and day of the year that God instructed Moses in Exodus 12 to take an unblemished male lamb of the first year and separate and watch over it for 4 days. Obviously, that was then sacrificed on Passover at twilight. It was also on the same day that Jesus fulfilled that pattern of sacrifice. He entered Jerusalem on this day to acclamations of Hosanna to the Son of David. It was the same day that Israel crossed the Jordan and ended up on the other side of the Jordan and encamped in Gilgal. And it was on the same day that Ezekiel saw the vision of the new city and a new temple of the restored kingdom, which we talked about, not so long ago in our study through Ezekiel. So interesting how these things, in terms of the 7s and the 70s and the 7s, all align. So, very interesting.
So the interpretation of these numbers, actually, one of the big questions here is when do we reckon the start of that that's right. actually is. So, so a starting point of the interpretation could be the command to rebuild the temple given by Cyrus in 539 BC. Yep. Unless a distinction is made between the temple and the city, in which case the time of Nehemiah would be the starting point. That'd be more like 445 BC. I did listen to an Old Testament scholar lecturing on this, and she proposed actually it was the word of Jeremiah to read that 70 year. It was from when that was given.
Okay.
So that's another view there as well. So
Or did we cover the decree that was given in Nehemiah by that the people would be released to go back to the
city? Well, see, it's interesting because
that was 444 BC. And
that's right. Yeah. So that's 444 that's right. So look, it's amazing how much discussion there is around this, and look, I did a bit of a survey of the scholarly commentaries, and I'm talking evangelical scholarly commentaries on this. There are differences of opinion on where to sort of start this from, and I know that there are various Bible teachers who very unequivocally present a sort of scheme and locate this right on the knocker of either when Jesus was crucified, or when Jesus 3 years before that, when he started his ministry. Those schemes, they do actually work out. And I think, so that tends to work out if you start at 444, or 445. Again, there's a few, it's dependent on a few things, but it does actually work out quite remarkably. The numbers do kind of work for that. But of course, that kind of depends on whether you take that, that sort of view. And, so for example, in the NAC, the New American Commentary, it says the view accepted here is that the decree to Ezra, it's that he takes the decree to Ezra in 458 as the correct starting point for the 77s. So he says that's where you land on AD 26, which is the time that many scholars believe that Christ was baptized and began his public ministry. So,
and if you start on 444 BC, which is when Artaxerxes in Nehemiah made the decree to release the Jews, then you land on 33 AD, which was when Christ was crucified, obviously. So
the interesting thing, though, Stu, if I can summarise is that with all the different schemes, this is the interesting thing about these numbers, is that they do all fall on quite significant dates.
Yeah.
This is what allows for these various arguments, because one scholar will say, well, if you take it from, so for example, the scholar that takes it from the decree of Jeremiah, which is even before the exile, that even lands on some really interesting dates as well. So it sort of has this multiple.
God's got it read.
This multiple reference.
Yeah.
And she even suggested that in the lecture I listened to, that maybe it does allow actually for multiple reference. Maybe that's part of it. Now, who knows? But I think it's a remarkable prophecy. I do quite like the couple of schemes, whether it's taken from 444 or 458.
Yeah.
The way that they both land on key
critical
aspects
dates.
of the ministry of Jesus. I think that actually is quite significant, and I quite like those views.
So at this point in time, we've sort of covered up to the
let's not get too bogged down.
The 69th 7, which is really up till Jesus's time, really, haven't we? If we look at those dates, But of course, we haven't seen the 70th.
Yeah, that's
7,
right. Yeah,
yet being completed. So. We're waiting for that. That's the future.
Well, yes, on one view, and there's a few different ways of viewing this, but certainly on one very prominent view, there's this stopping of the prophetic clock at the time of Christ, and then there's the gathering in of the nations, and then the clock starts again for the tribulation at the end, and that's the 70th week of Daniel. Now, again, that's one interpretation. I think it has its merits. With interpretation of prophecy, I often feel it is wisest not to lock down on one interpretation too much. Yeah. So I tend to say things like that. Look, there are strengths to that interpretation. I'll be quite happy if that's the case. Be looking out for what is the case, but I tend not to lock down too much on one. I just think it's wisest to keep a bit of an open mind. So as we move into chapter 10...
I just want to mention one more thing about chapter 9. I think one of the things that probably would have really staggered Daniel, because again, we obviously know the purpose and the process for the Messiah, but Daniel didn't. To read in verse 25 that the Messiah was going to be killed would have been like, wait, what?
Yeah.
What do you mean that the Messiah is meant to be coming to save us? And so that would have been something that would really have challenged Daniel's thinking in terms of what would happen with the Messiah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because it talks about finishing transgression, atoning for wickedness. It talks about the anointed one, the ruler. it's...
And then he'd be cut off.
Yeah, that's right. He'll be cut off from his... Yeah, that's right. So, very...
And Daniel would have been thinking, hang on, the Messiah's meant to be our deliverer, and he's just being killed and cut off? What's with this?
That's right. Yeah.
Now, of course, that was predicted anyway in the 53rd chapter of Isaiah, right. So that's there. But there we go. And of course, it does also say just at the end of that until the end there will be war. And if we look at what's happening in the world, there really hasn't been a season where either for the nation of Israel, if you want to take it directly relating to the nation of Israel as being a sign, or the world really, there's been constant conflict somewhere in the world.
Good. So just again, because there's a lot of complexity there, another big picture summary here. The significance of the sevens particularly is that this is saying, in answer to Daniel's prayer, so he's prayed this prayer, he's prayed for forgiveness for his people. In a sense, the answer is better than what he would have even asked for.
Yes.
Because it's not just about the release from a historical exile. What the angel is saying to him is, I've got something even better than that.
That's right.
There is the release from captivity to sin, and it's coming, and it's going to come at exactly the right time. And that's the significance of the sevens, of dividing things up into sevens, because 7 is the number of perfection. Right?
Yep.
So the angel is saying that God has a time nominated, just so that you know, it's going to happen. There's a nominated time for it, and this is when it's going to happen. But you don't, and I think one of the things that biblical prophecy resists is that we would not know the day or the hour. You get that in Jesus' teaching. And so I think the use of sevens here, and even the fact that it's difficult to nail down, I actually think that's important, because he wants to say...
be ready.
He wants to say, be ready. It's going to happen at the perfect time, hence the use of sevens.
Yeah, right.
I think that's what that's indicating. Just to underscore this fact that God is sovereign, it's all, you just know for certain that it's going to happen at the perfect time.
Totally.
That's the big picture.
One of the notes I wrote down particularly around Daniel's prayer, was that Daniel was thinking about getting Israel out of Babylon, but God was concerned about getting Babylon out of Israel once and for all.
Right.
It was just
in the biggest sense of Babylon, the world. Yeah,
exactly
that's right.
Yeah.
So it's not just captivity to Babylon, it's captivity to sin.
Correct.
And so that's where you get this, the answer is bigger than Daniel even prayed for. I think that's wonderful.
Absolutely.
Cool. Chapter 10, Stu, what do we got?
We read here that again, a vision on the 24th day of the first month, I was standing on the bank of the great river, the Tigris. I looked up, and there before me was a man dressed in linen, with a belt of the finest gold around his waist. His body was like chrysolite, his face like lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and his voice like the sound of a multitude. And of course, again, we've got a bit of toing and froing, from the scholars as to whether or not this was Jesus or an angel of some kind. Certainly, there are very much similarities between that and the vision that John got in his book of Revelation.
That's right.
So I think it's interesting to recognise that. But then we move on to this angelic conflict that's taking place. So this is kind of the vision of what's happening in heaven while Daniel's praying his prayer. In chapter 10, verse 13, we hear about the prince of the Persian kingdom.
That's right. So it's quite likely actually that the man dressed in linen is a vision of God. That's a theophany. But that the one who interprets, because we automatically assume that the one that then speaks to him is the same one. But there's a good argument to say that there's this vision, he's overwhelmed with terror, his strength leaves him and he falls to the ground, right? Basically passes out from this vision. And then a hand touched him, and this voice says to him, and I think that, it may well be that that's an angelic, because God often speaks through angels.
Yes.
So you still have that mediatorial thing happening there. The mediatorial thing is important. It's not very often that God will just speak directly to a person. Often it's through a mediating angel. And so I think that's a good interpretation, the idea that there's a theophany, there's this kind of vision of God in this sense. And then we get this angelic figure that speaks to him. It's interesting. He says here, Stu, do not be afraid, Daniel, since the first day you set your mind to gain understanding and humble yourself before your God. Your words were heard, and I have come in response to them. But the prince of the Persian kingdom resisted me 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me because I was detained there with the king of Persia. Now I have come to explain to you, da-da-da-da-da. Now, we think, what's going on here? Well, I mean, in the ancient world context, they would have said, so because remember they believed in these localized deities, really, and that's actually a biblical idea in the sense that there's indication in the end of Deuteronomy that God apportioned the nations according to the sons of God, or the sort of angelic beings, albeit fallen, and that they were given charge in a sense of various regions, right? And so you get these territorial, albeit fallen angelic beings who control these areas. And so this looks like what's happened here is that, he's been on his way, but he's been fighting because this is now Persia. We're in Persia right now, okay? Yeah. So in a sense, he's been fighting for Daniel to make these things possible. So there's this kind of angelic, there's this sort of, not between equal forces, but still, there are some times when, in a sense, God or the forces of God seem to be contained within the boundaries of creation that God has set, and that things are played out within those boundaries for some reason. And so it looks like here there's some kind of angelic battle going on in the heavenly realms. We don't get much information, but he's saying, Daniel, there's way more going on here behind the scenes than you know about. There is a spiritual battle going on behind here. This is opening up. This is what these visions are doing now, is that they're opening up reality.
Heaven, really?
That's right. They're opening up reality so that we recognize there is a spiritual battle going on. There is a battle for our souls. I mean, the New Testament really keeps this window to reality open. It doesn't explain it in a lot of detail, but we're very much led to understand that we are in the midst of a vaster, much bigger spiritual battle, a battle for our souls, a battle for the world primarily. Yeah. Now, God is sovereign over that battle. He even uses that battle to bring evil to the surface and so forth, so that evil might be defeated. That's the way that God works. Yep. He stirs it up, brings it to the surface to bring it down. We've even seen that in Daniel chapter 7. So this is the kind of battle that's going on behind the scenes here.
And we see that in our own lives as well, just as a straight application, when God starts to bring things to the surface and we want to push them back down again.
Yeah, that's right.
And the way God helps us to deal with these things is by bringing them to the surface.
The final vision, unless there's more that you want to say about that, so we can jump to the final vision, which we'll treat in broad terms. The final vision of Daniel gives. Talk about, magnifying glass now. We've seen how we get this broad view, like in Daniel chapter 7, and also then again in Daniel chapter 9. And where you get these broad view sweeps of history, then it tends to focus in on something important. And here again, you get this focus on events surrounding the Greek emperor Antiochus Epiphanes. Basically, what we have here in chapter 11 is a detailed description of the historical events that lead up to Antiochus Epiphanes, some of the things that are going to happen during his rule. And this is very much summarising the chapter and won't get drawn down too much into the details. I mean, it all corresponds with what happens very closely, actually. And there's an amazing amount of detail here. And then, in verse 21, that's when we get to Antiochus Epiphanes, talks about the contemptible person, talks about the trouble during his period, his time. It talks about the desecration of the temple, the abolition of the daily sacrifice, the setting up of the abomination that causes desolation. So there's quite a bit of detail that talks about that very important moment, actually, that again is a sort of prefiguration of some kind of final period. Because then that's important because it jumps from this, what is essentially a prefiguration, to this final period seamlessly
into the future.
Because from chapter 36, really without taking a breath,
verse 36,
we jump to verse 36, that's right, of chapter 11, we jump to a king, and from here the language seems to be bigger. It's seems to be projecting further beyond that event. And again, you get this prophetic foreshortening here. And we got a view beyond the end to, even from verse 40 there, it looks like he's speaking about what Revelation talks about as the Battle of Armageddon. Yeah. And then as you move into chapter 12, it says, at that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. There will be a time of distress, such as not has happened from the beginning of nations until then. Jesus used similar language to this. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, roll up, seal the words of this scroll until the time of the end. So he's predicting there this final defeat. Similar. We've seen this sweep again and again,
yes.
haven't we?
Yeah.
We just get the historical circumstances surrounding the Greek Empire, the lead up to Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth. He is the prefiguration of the final Antichrist. So we get that in a lot more detail, but then we get a sort of a different version of that final great defeat and the resurrection of the dead here. The resurrection of all the dead and the ushering in of, and this time of trouble, that he says will last for times and half a time.
Which Jesus,
kind of 3.5 years. Yeah.
Jesus speaks to Matthew 24:21 when he says there'll be a great tribulation, but it'll be cut short. For the sake of the elect, the days will be cut short.
Yeah, that's right. And so the times and half a time is half a 7.
Yes,
that's the cutting short. So whether that's a literal period or a literal period, and a lot of people think there'll be that final 7 will be a period of tribulation. Will be cut in half for God's people. I mean, there are a few different interpretations of this, and we won't get bogged down in that. The point is that right at the end of Daniel, you get this stunning prophecy that looks forward to the final resurrection of all the dead. So one of the key things during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes is that you have really the beginning of, we've seen plenty of martyrdom before. Prophets were martyred, of course, for their message. But here, during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, there are a lot of martyrs, people that are killed for their faith. And that's where the importance of the mention of the resurrection, because, it talks about, the wise shining and those who led many to righteousness, they will shine like stars in the heavens. Yep. So it's predicting the reward, the resurrection and the reward for those who remain faithful during the time of tribulation. So that's the importance of the promise of the resurrection, the general resurrection of the dead in that chapter. And so, again, it finishes with these words in chapter 12, verse 13, "As for you, go your way until the end, you will rest. And then at the end of the days, you will arise to receive your allotted inheritance." It says that to Daniel.
Yeah.
You will rest, you will die, but at the end of days, you will rise again to receive your allotted inheritance. What an event. And that's really what God says to all of us. As for you, go your way till the end. Like, walk in God's way. Do the things that God has called you to do. Then you will rest. And at the time of the end of days, you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Thrive Deeper. Our home on the internet is thrivetoday.tv. You can contact us, ask questions, see all our resources and much more at our website thrivetoday.tv. We really appreciate the questions and thoughts about what you're reading as we go through the Bible with Thrive. Until next time, our prayer is that these shows will inspire you to go deeper and thrive.